I don't think it's an understatement to say that Kenpachi Zaraki is the very embodiment of brute strength within the world of Bleach. He is a character whose immense power is so deeply intertwined with his character that it is impossible to even mention Kenpachi without talking about his power level. Any Shinigami who has held the title of Kenpachi has had an unmatched level of combat strength. However, Kenpachi Zaraki doesn't just meet the expectations of the title of Kenpachi, he excels above and beyond anything that we can expect from a Kenpachi of his era. If I were to explain it in Jujutsu Kaisen terms, while the other Kenpachis were deemed to be the strongest of their time, Kenpachi Zaraki on the other hand has held the title of Kenpachi because he is the strongest in all of history, similar to how Satoru Gojo is the strongest Jujutsu sorcerer of all time. Throughout the story of Bleach, Kenpachi Zaraki's raw power is consistently showcased to us. He has a plethora of remarkable and awe-inspiring feats that he showcases in battle. There are multiple times when he is referred to as the strongest Shinigami, and even after the end of the 1000-year Blood War arc, he is referred to as the most powerful Shinigami alive in the Can't For Your Own World light novels. Now, I have spent quite a lot of time poring over the manga and researching all of the available material of Bleach in order to give my thoughts on the matter of whether if Kenpachi is the strongest Shinigami after all. How does his strength compare to the monsters that are the Zero Division, especially after everything that we have come to know about them following the release of Core 2 of the 1000-year Blood War arc anime. With all of these new additions being made to the anime, is Kenpachi still the strongest Shinigami? Is there still an untapped level of his power that he is yet to show us? In this video, I'm going to answer the question once and for all: how strong is Kenpachi Zaraki? So without further delay, let's begin our exploration of Kenpachi Zaraki's true power. So getting straight to the point, when we discuss Kenpachi's strength, we're going to have to do a quick rundown on the history of his power progression before we begin to analyze every major stat and feat that he achieves, similar to what I did in my video power scaling Ichigo's strength at the end of Bleach. Kenpachi is a very interesting character to power scale because he starts out as being immensely powerful. Even as a child, he was stronger than Yachiru Unohana, but after battling her at such a young age, his power level had fallen off a cliff. To truly put into perspective just how massive this drop was, he ended up drawing against false Shikai Ichigo during the Soul Society arc. Thankfully, Kenpachi's progression throughout the story helps him to reach the #1 spot once again, with each battle that he partakes in allowing him to unlock a restriction that is placed upon his powers. And before too long, he reclaims his original power during the 1000-year Blood War arc, and he even surpasses it by the end of the story arc. If you were to draw a graph of Kenpachi's power level, there would be a massive fluctuation up with a steep drop down, and then with a parabolic rise which rises well beyond the previous peak. So let's start to unravel the mystery behind Kenpachi's supposedly infinite strength. Kenpachi Zaraki transcends the conventional limits of potential power. The amount of untapped power that he has rivals the likes of Ichigo and even Hikone. He was born with an insane amount of natural potential. I mean, he was so strong that even as a child he had surpassed the Kenpachi of the original Gotei 13, which when you put into context, if he was facing off against Yachiru Unohana on this level, then you can guarantee that he would have put up a better fight against Head Captain Yamamoto than literally any of the other captains within the Gotei 13 at the beginning of the Bleach story. Now, despite the fact that Kenpachi does lose almost all of this power, I'd like for us to just keep this in mind as we go into sections of the story where he is significantly weaker than this. This level of potential strength is the equivalent to Ichigo's potential power in episode 1. If Kenpachi did not impose subconscious restrictions to his own power, then there is no doubt that his potential strength and power would have only continued to rise from this point. You could argue that the Kenpachi at the end of the 1000-year Blood War arc is still significantly weaker than a version of him who did not subconsciously restrict his own power and had continued to rise exponentially along with the potential power that he had from birth. Kenpachi has barely learned enough of the skills needed to truly cement himself as a master of Zanjutsu. The little that we do see him use is extremely powerful, and it is what ultimately results in him defeating Nnoitora during the Arrancar arc. But this isn't to say that he has no potential to grow as a swordsman, because Kenpachi's potential is so terrifying that the Central 46 had to call off his Zanjutsu training after they had witnessed how powerful he had become after training with Yamamoto for only a single day. The old geezers over at the Central 46 did not want to train such a powerful Shinigami who may one day turn against them, similar to how Tozen, Aizen and Gin had done. So it stands to reason that Kenpachi's potential power goes beyond just his strength, and it even affects his skill. But as you'll all come to know, Kenpachi isn't going to really require that much skill, because his level of innate power is so high that he doesn't even really need Zanjutsu at all in order to be considered as the strongest Shinigami. The threat of Kenpachi's power isn't lost on the major villains within Bleach. Aizen in particular had decided to completely avoid fighting Kenpachi altogether until he had attained immortality. This detail is revealed to us within the Bleach databooks, and is probably the only reason why this feat is so extremely underrated, because it's not really known by that many fans. Because in context, Aizen, before gaining the power of the Hokyoku, nor was he the type to underestimate an opponent's power. Aizen's the type of character known for meticulously planning and countering every threat. For example, like how he had created the Arrancar Wonderwise in order to neutralize the flames of Yamamoto's Zanpakuto. In regards to Kenpachi, Aizen's plan wasn't very convoluted. He had simply avoided him altogether. Kenpachi wasn't even in the same power range as some of the top Espada. He had struggled quite a bit against Nnoitora, the 5th ranking Espada, despite him easily defeating Nnoitora by simply wielding his Zanpakuto with both of his hands. And during his battle against the strongest 0 ranking Espada, Yammy, we are aware that he was assisted by Byakuya, which makes it difficult for Kenpachi to take the complete credit for defeating the strongest Espada. So it's safe to assume that Kenpachi at this point in the story did not match up to Aizen's base level of power, since it's easy to scale Aizen as being stronger than the Espada who Kenpachi had struggled against. Villains like Aizen fear Kenpachi's limitless potential. They don't want to risk him being able to unlock some of the massive reserves of power that he possesses. So in the end, Aizen's strategy for dealing with Kenpachi was just to avoid him. During the 1000-Year Blood War arc, we see that this sentiment carries forward, with how Yhwach lists Kenpachi as one of his 5 war potentials, a list of 5 of the most dangerous Shinigami who pose the biggest threat against the Quincy. Now, Yhwach and his Sternritter are a whole different class of enemy in comparison to Aizen and the Espada. At the beginning of the 1000-Year Blood War arc, we see Yhwach casually defeat Kenpachi, and even after defeating Kenpachi, Yhwach leaves the body to the doppelganger Sternritter Royd, trusting him to finish the job while he goes to Muken in order to speak to Aizen. These early portions of the first Quincy invasion lead me to believe that Yhwach had intended to kill Kenpachi because of how immensely powerful he was, and knowing that he was able to get even stronger than this point because he was barely at the peak of his power. Their failure to eliminate Kenpachi at the beginning of the Quincy War was something that the Sternritter had tried to rectify later on during the story arc, because immediately after Kenpachi's battle against Gremmy, when he is actually exhausted, the Bambis all appear and gang up on Kenpachi as they beat down the badly wounded Shinigami. Shinji even confirms that if they were to lose Kenpachi, then it would spell defeat for the Shinigami in their war against the Quincy. As you can see throughout the story, Kenpachi's strength and power are consistently depicted as something to look out for, due to his power level exponentially increasing following every battle that he takes part in. After explaining his innate talent and potential for growth, it becomes clear that this validates a lot of the sentiments towards Kenpachi's power level, and the reason why fans consistently scale him as being one of the strongest characters in the story. Now, you have to remember that we've been speaking about Kenpachi's character without taking into consideration the potential power growth of his Shikai and Bankai, because they grant him an infinite level of power which transforms him into a monster that only a few can compete with within the Bleach universe. So after having spoken about Kenpachi's potential for growth, I want to now move on to discussing his level of skill, because surprisingly this is something that a good number of fans and people online tend to believe that it's a department that Kenpachi is lacking in, when in actuality this couldn't be further from the truth. Kenpachi's skill in Zanjutsu is an extremely interesting subject of discussion, because when it comes to formal Zanjutsu as a form of combat and all of the numerous techniques that are associated with it, Kenpachi knows almost none of it. This is aside from that one time that Yamamoto had tried to teach him Kendo, which again had made the Central 46 so afraid that they had immediately called off his training. So because of this, he has very little experience or knowledge of Zanjutsu or swordsmanship. The only thing that he remembers is the basic Kendo principle of the need to hold a sword with both hands, which is a principle that he applies to a devastating effect during his battle against Nnoitora. Fans of Kenpachi will be more than aware of the greatest asset that he possesses in battle, which isn't his fighting skill, but rather his beastly instinct within battle. Because of this fighting style, Kenpachi has very little focus on the actual technicalities and intricacies of battle. So it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to just say that Kenpachi brute forces his way through every single fight. But this is a big misconception that I spread online, because I believe that he instinctively moves his sword in order to counter the strikes of his enemies when he needs to, and in the same way he instinctively attacks his enemies with strikes that have a high probability of landing. Now you might roll your eyes and think that this is merely just a nice way of saying that Kenpachi has absolutely no skills and he would be easily defeated in a fight against an actually skilled opponent, but this really isn't the case, because first of all, Kenpachi is in a universe brimming with some of the most skilled swordsmen in all of fiction, with almost all of them having centuries of experience under their belts. Kenpachi not only fights some of these swordsmen, but he even fights and defeats enemies who could have given them a run for their money in terms of skill. You have really skilled characters like Ikkaku, who in the present timeline of the story teaches swordsmanship to the next generation, like Renji and Rukia's child Ichika, who is mentored by him. Now when Ikkaku had fought Kenpachi in the past, he ended up losing to him. As you can see, skill was far from the determining factor in this encounter. And no, nothing about their fight seems to imply that Kenpachi had one-shotted Ikkaku. Their encounter lasted long enough for Ikkaku to demonstrate his skills, which in the end simply weren't enough because Kenpachi had came out on top. Opponents like Nnoitora and some of the Sternritter would have been very difficult for some of the highly skilled Shinigami to fight against, but Kenpachi was able to defeat them effortlessly, and this is credited to his instinctive battle style. This combat style is best demonstrated during both of Kenpachi's battles against Yachiru Unohana. Despite Unohana pretty much battling against a child, she for the first time in a very long while had found a worthy adversary. Unohana was also dubbed as Yachiru, which literally translates to 8,000 sword styles. Now this could be taken literally to imply that she had mastered over 8,000 different swordsmanship styles, or it could just be a title that was given to her because she was literally a master of the sword at this time when she had battled against a young Kenpachi. So it would be safe to assume that she would have been able to utilize multiple different sword styles as well as techniques through her many years of training, as well as all of the experiences that she would have amassed up until this point of the story while battling against God knows how many other skilled swordsmen over the centuries. She was not just a master of the blade, she was effectively an extremely experienced executioner. To be as blunt as possible, I could say that Yachiru Unohana was more skilled than 95% of anime swordsmen. Now the reason that I'm bringing all of this up is that this is the opponent that a child Kenpachi had fought against. They had a lengthy battle which wasn't just won by Kenpachi brute forcing his way through the fight. He used his instincts in order to bridge the gap of skill and experience between the two of them, proving that Kenpachi's battle instincts are second to none. So despite what you read online, Kenpachi is not just some dumb brute who relies solely on his strength in order to win his fights. He has a certain way of fighting, and this needs to be appreciated in order to properly scale Kenpachi. When he had fought against Unohana as a child, he demonstrated that he was completely superior to her in all facets of combat. As a child, his fighting technique was so effective that it had prevented Unohana from using more of her techniques against him, which means that Kenpachi's fighting style doesn't just allow him to gain the upper hand over his enemies, but it actively limits their ability to fight back as they normally would, because he is constantly pressing them. This again is part of the reason why it's difficult for any swordsman to outskill Kenpachi. He doesn't just randomly swing his sword around, but rather he instinctively makes the right moves in response to his opponents until he's finally able to seal in his victory. This concept is present throughout the entirety of all of his battles in the story. So even when he goes up against opponents who should be traditionally more skilled than he is never really at a disadvantage. There is one other massively underrated aspect of Kenpachi's skill that a lot of fans, including myself, have overlooked, which is the fact that Kenpachi engages almost every battle with only one working eye. This is because he begins almost every battle with his spiritual pressure stealing eye patch on, and while most of us acknowledge the massive role that this eye patch plays in restricting Kenpachi's power, none of us really consider the huge tactical disadvantage that comes with having only one eye in a fight, especially when you're dealing with highly skilled swordsmen who are dealing out multiple high-speed attacks. You could argue that it's a good thing that Bleach characters have Reikaku, which is spiritual pressure detection, so they don't need to really rely on their eyes to know where their opponents are, but unfortunately this isn't the case for Kenpachi, because this version of his character had far worse spiritual pressure detection, which is part of the reason why he has a hard time finding his way around the Soul Society. During Kenpachi's battle against Ichigo, he explains that he wears the eye patch along with the bells on his hair so that he can keep his fights interesting. He is is literally disadvantaging himself by limiting his power with the eye patch, as well as only having half of his sight, which is an undeniable handicap, and with the bells allowing his opponents to easily detect his location. It is a testament to his incredible fighting style, which allows him to prevail despite all of these factors working against him. Think about it, he's had to fight so many different battles with his eyesight at half of its usual capacity. This is what leads me to believe that Kenpachi is a master of the blade, and I do hope that more fans recognize this. This now brings us to our next point of discussion, which would be Kenpachi's immense strength and his spiritual pressure. One of the great things about scaling characters like Kenpachi, who primarily rely on physical combat, is the realization that their Reiatsu or their spiritual pressure determines their strength, durability, as well as attack potency. So in order to better understand Kenpachi's progression of power, I think that it's best that we start from the conclusion of the Arrancar arc, specifically examining his team battle alongside Byakuya Kuchiki against Yammy, which thankfully provides us some valuable insights. This battle gives us several conclusions that we can draw upon. The first is that we can confirm that at the very least Yammy had the greatest amount of spiritual energy as well as spiritual pressure out of all of the Espada, despite him being one of the worst fighters amongst the group. This is a fact laid out within the Bleach databooks, and not to mention, due to the nature of Yammy's resurrection, he had the greatest power ceiling out of all of the Espada, and he had the potential to grow even more powerful than this, meaning that Yammy should be perfectly capable of replicating Ulquiorra's insane destructive feats, and dare I say, even capable of going beyond this. However, it's important to note that attack potency and destructive capability don't always need to be equal. In other words, Yammy doesn't necessarily have to replicate Ulquiorra's specific feats in order to be considered stronger than him. During Kenpachi and Byakuya's battle, they jointly defeat Yammy, albeit with considerable difficulty. Unfortunately, much of this fight occurs off-screen, leaving the specifics of their individual contributions somewhat ambiguous. However, the overarching takeaway is that both Kenpachi and Byakuya were successfully able to overcome Yammy together, and this wouldn't have been possible if Kenpachi wasn't directly relative to Yammy in power. This can be inferred given how spiritual pressure is a decisive factor within battles between physically orientated fighters like Kenpachi. Now, if we were to stack on additional training that Kenpachi had received between the Arrancar arc and the insane feats that he had performed within the Spirits Are Forever With You light novel, which takes place during the 17 months between the Arrancar arc and the Fullbring arc, you can at the very least place Kenpachi above the Espada as a whole, which admittedly isn't really saying much because this could also be said for almost every single Sternritter. Now, this fact may disappoint some fans of the Espada, but it's just a reflection of the ever-evolving power dynamics within Bleach. Now, if we're speculating about the upper limits of Kenpachi's power, we enter a realm where terms like continental, multi-continental, or even planetary become relevant. This is especially true when we consider how he was able to defeat Soya Azashiro's most formidable technique, which is described as surpassing even the Sokyoku in terms of raw power. However, before going into the actual scaling for Kenpachi's Reiatsu, there's one massive variable that needs to be considered, which is the fact that Kenpachi fights with a good chunk of his spiritual pressure sealed away. This is of course so that he can prolong and enjoy his battles more without his pesky powers getting in the way of his fun. He does this through the custom-made eye patch that he wears, which absorbs a good portion of his spiritual pressure, and it weakens him enough so that he can fight opponents that are far weaker than himself. It is said that the eye patch reduces his spiritual pressure to a similar level to the opponent that he is fighting. Now, this eye patch is going to be a key in figuring out just how much power Kenpachi really has and just how much he can potentially have when he takes it off. In order to do this, there's one question that we need to answer. How much does this eye patch actually limit Kenpachi's power? While it is challenging to pinpoint an exact figure, there are ways to approximate the extent of the power reduction, at least during the events of the Soul Society arc. This is going to really help us understand the full scope of Kenpachi's power once he removes all of his self-imposed handicaps. The best indicator which reveals just how much power is restricted is by taking a close look at his battle against Ichigo in the Soul Society arc. When he first starts his battle with Ichigo, it's implied that he's actually so much stronger than him to the extent that Ichigo is unable to even land a single blow against him. In my opinion, I don't believe this to be the case. This battle closely mirrors Ichigo's final showdown with Grimmjow, where his inner conflict had hindered his ability to fully unleash his powers. In the case of Kenpachi's battle battle, Ichigo's significant struggle wasn't due to the lack of his strength, but rather it stemmed from his paralyzing fear that he had experienced upon learning that Chad had been defeated, an ally who up until this point in the story had given no reason for Ichigo to doubt in his abilities. If you remember, he had referred to Chad as a character who we could not imagine losing. As the story has progressed, it's easy to understand how this phrase has become a meme, but at this point in the story, we genuinely didn't know any better. This revelation ignites a newfound determination within Ichigo as it enables him to finally inflict some damage against Kenpachi. Kenpachi then begins to get serious and the two fight pretty much evenly for a while. And this leads me to believe that Ichigo was just as strong as sealed Kenpachi when his fight against him had begun. Now this isn't crazy considering that Kenpachi was limiting himself to the point that he could enjoy a fight with literally anyone, and Ichigo had grown beyond the lieutenant ranges of power at this point, and it was safe to assume that he was edging towards the lower bounds of a captain's full strength. So it would make sense that Ichigo during the Soul Society arc is somewhere in between being above a lieutenant tier but still weaker than a full power captain ranking Shinigami, which is where sealed Kenpachi would also logically exist. After Kenpachi appears to have defeated Ichigo, things get interesting because Ichigo acquires a seemingly unquantifiable power up from Zangetsu. This allows him to even match unsealed Kenpachi's power and stalemate him. Now this brings me to my current point, which is the fact that Ichigo's power up isn't anywhere near as unquantifiable as we'd like to think, because the first move that Zangetsu uses is Blut Veen, which he uses to halt Ichigo's bleeding, along with the Zenkai boost that souls within Bleach experience from surviving near-death encounters. It is this combination of power increases which allows Ichigo to hang with Kenpachi until they have their final clash when he unseals his power. Zangetsu explains that he is releasing the Blut Veen, after which Ichigo gains another massive power-up which takes the shape of his Hollow Mask. This leads me to believe that after stopping the Blut Veen, Old Man Zangetsu had allowed Ichigo to tap into his hollow powers, which he had momentarily used in order to draw with Kenpachi. This power boost that Ichigo had was similar to him wearing his Hollow Mask. Now we can't really claim that this was actually a similar multiplier as his normal holification, since his hollow powers were less developed back during the Soul Society arc. So if normal holification was implied to be at least the same multiplier as Bankai, which is really underselling it because holification is higher than Bankai, a conservative figure that we can settle on is a 10 times multiplier. Now if we apply this to Kenpachi, who was also Ichigo's equal before taking off the eye patch, it would mean that Kenpachi was only accessing 10% of his current power while wearing the eye patch, which checks out when you consider the fact that Kenpachi was a captain and had lowered his spiritual pressure to the point that even characters as weak as Ichigo at the time could keep up with him. This is why I've always found it hilarious when people try to say that Kenpachi was originally the weakest captain in the Soul Society arc, but that's a whole nother topic which warrants a conversation of its own. So the eye patch that Kenpachi was wearing at the very beginning of the series was holding back a whopping 90% of his power. We were able to deduce this from the fact that Ichigo post power up had progressed from just being equal to Kenpachi to the point where he was surpassing him. Now when Kenpachi removes his eye patch and unleashes his full power, it grants him a similar amount of power which bumps him back up to Ichigo's new level. So it is clear that both of them had gained similar amounts of power from their respective power-ups. Now this gets even more intriguing after the time skip, when Kenpachi wears a new eye patch. At first glance, you may assume that this updated eye patch further diminishes his power, potentially below 10%, but upon closer examination, I don't think that this is the case. I think that the reason that Kenpachi actually needed a new eye patch was because it originally only consumed a certain amount of spiritual energy when it was first made by Mayuri. Back then, Kenpachi was significantly weaker, so that amount being drained ended up being about 90% of his energy. But after Kenpachi's multiple power-ups throughout the story, all the way up until 17 months after the Arrancar arc, the specific amount of energy being drained by his eye patch would have ended up being nowhere near enough to affect Kenpachi's current level of power, which is why he needed to attain an even higher level of power restriction to match his now higher power. This means that he needed an eye patch that consumes even more energy than before. And if Mayuri truly is the great scientist that he claims himself to be, then this eye patch needs to be equivalent to the original one in terms of the percentage of power that it consumes, which would mean that his new eye patch also restricts 90% of his power. So after figuring out the eye patch restriction, we can assume assume that any feat that Kenpachi performs with his eye patch removed would end up being multiplied by 10 times. Now this notion further extends to his Shikai and Bankai forms, but I'll talk more about that a bit later on. Bearing all of this in mind, we can begin to discuss where exactly we can tier Kenpachi. Starting off from the end of the Arrancar arc, Kenpachi can be comfortably placed at the top, right below the god tiers, who would be Ichigo and Aizen in their respective transcendent forms. Of course, Kenpachi would also be below characters like Unohana, Yamamoto, and arguably the likes of Ukitake and Shunsui, who would also scale above him at this point. However, when we consider the threat level that Kenpachi had faced during the Arrancar arc, it's safe to say that Kenpachi's position is still notably high, considering he eclipses the likes of Resurrection Yammy, who despite being very powerful in terms of his raw strength, lacks any real form of skill for Kenpachi to fight against. So it positions Kenpachi above most of the characters, and this is before considering the massive power jumps that he experiences within the Spirits Are Forever With You light novels. So I would say that he starts off at least with the multi-continental to planetary ranges of power at the very beginning of the 1000-year Blood War arc. He then gets beaten into a coma for the duration of the first invasion, but he wakes up not too long after this and has his battle with Yachiru Unohana. And it's within this battle that Kenpachi grows unquantifiably more powerful as he sheds all of his subconscious limitations and truly ascends to a point where he has awakened his full potential. We could make an estimate of sorts as to just how much power Kenpachi had gained following every time that he was nearly killed and then healed by Yachiru Unohana, but it wouldn't be accurate since we really have no idea how many times this cycle was repeated. So the best way of measuring how much power he gains is by analyzing the feats that he performs following his battle with Unohana. During the second invasion of the Quincy, it is safe to assume that he is far above planetary in terms of his power, so much so that even while still wearing his eye patch, he proves to be more than a match for Gremmy. One of the most impressive feats that he performs is against Gremmy's meteor, where he completely shatters it with a single swing from his Shikai. This meteor is visibly shown to be larger than the Wandenreich's citadel, which is around the same size as the Serite. This size comparison is further supported by Gremmy's statement, where he states that the meteor has enough power to erase the entire Serite. Contextualizing this feat becomes even more astonishing, especially when you consider Kenpachi's past battles. He has faced off against and overpowered an attack stated to be even more powerful than the Sokyoku when he had fought against Azashiro when he was far weaker. Yet, despite still wearing his eye patch, Kenpachi felt the need to release his Zanpakuto no Zarashi in order to go up against Gremmy's meteor, which implies that Kenpachi perceived this meteor to be a far greater threat than Azashiro's Reishi blade. This is further supported by the fact that pretty much everyone was losing their minds over how much of a threat this meteor was, to the point that even Hashward, Askin, and multiple Shinigami were shown to be visibly terrified by what was coming for them. So it makes sense that in actuality, Gremmy's imagination had made that meteor far more powerful than its size had suggested it to be. With the battle continuing, Gremmy creates even more clones and grows far more powerful, and he performs another massive feat that has proven to be a source of contention for fans for quite some time now. Considering that I'm discussing Kenpachi, I feel that this would be a great time to address it since it directly correlates to his power scaling. Now, there are blatant statements within Can't For Your Own World about Gremmy actually creating the void of space that he trapped Kenpachi within, but there's another aspect to this feat that often gets overlooked by fans, which is the fact that Kubo wrote that fight in a manner where the things that Gremmy created would gradually escalate until they hit a peak. This escalation is evident right from the beginning of their battle, which had started off with lava before moving on to water and then firearms, as we then escalated to planetary feats all the way to the meteor which had appeared, which proves that every threat that Gremmy was manifesting was on a grander scale than the last one. This all culminates in Gremmy creating a clone of himself, which raises his power enough for him to create that meteor. He jumps from merely creating weapons and elemental hazards to creating an extinction class phenomena, with the addition of just a single clone. And after his meteor is destroyed, he creates even more of these clones, thus further multiplying his power to even greater heights. It is this evolving, heightened level of power that allows him to go from being just able to create something that exists within space to then imagining space itself. Now, it's quite literally the logical progression of everything that he was creating. If you accept that his imagination was able to conjure a meteor, then I think that it's hard to refute him manifesting space itself. So with a few clones, Gremmy is able to create a literal galaxy to trap Kenpachi within, and this is further supported by Kubo's end of chapter sketch where he shows Gremmy creating what appears to be at least a solar system with his shrift ability. The takeaway from his battle against Gremmy is that he had went up against a literal galaxy creating godlike entity and he had come out on top, though at this point Gremmy had also started to inflict heavy damage on Kenpachi, so I'd like to think that with some extra clones, Gremmy might have grown just as strong or stronger than Kenpachi with his eye patch on, which as I've discussed earlier in the video means that he was limited to only 10% of his true power. The limit of Kenpachi's power with his eye patch on is evident, as he becomes extremely exhausted after Gremmy's death. This had happened after Gremmy had attempted to imagine the full strength of Kenpachi. Kenpachi's exhaustion leaves him vulnerable to being attacked by the Bambis. I am arguing that Gremmy's cloning had already pushed him into the same ranges of power as Kenpachi, but then why did Gremmy attempt to imitate his power? Well, this is because he had only become as strong as Kenpachi with his eye patch on, which is far from surpassing his full power. In his final moments, when Gremmy is recounting events in order to figure out what went wrong, he states that there was nothing wrong with his imagination, because he was able to perfectly imagine Kenpachi's full power, which is something that some fans for some reason misinterpret to mean that he had imagined Kenpachi's future power with his Bankai, when in actuality it was clearly referring to the power that Kenpachi had possessed within that moment, which was being heavily restricted by his eye patch. This was the power that Gremmy was trying to get for himself, which ended up killing him. It's arguable that Kenpachi with his eye patch is not on par with multi-clone Gremmy, as the latter exhibits more extraordinary feats such as galaxy creation, and just because he was able to escape from that galaxy dimension, it does not inherently mean that he has the power to destroy or create a galaxy. This is evidenced by Gremmy's ability to severely wound Kenpachi during their fight. These are wounds that left Kenpachi vulnerable to attack afterwards. Yet despite these impressive feats, Gremmy ultimately could not withstand the full unrestrained power of Kenpachi, which leads me to believe that Kenpachi's true strength is in the galactic ranges of power after his battle with Gremmy. Moving on to his next main battle during the 1000-Year Blood War arc, and it's Kenpachi up against Gerard Valkyrie. Now this is a fight that proves to be an even greater challenge since he goes all out right from the start, but even Kenpachi proves to be no match for Gerard's broken, or should I say extremely powerful abilities, thus leading to him awakening his Bankai, which we can assume is 5 to 10 times greater than his Shikai's power, which would raise him to the low ends of the multi-galactic power tier. We unfortunately don't get to see too much of this new Bankai transformation before it proves to be just too much for Kenpachi's body to handle as he ends up collapsing, thus meaning that by the time that the Bleach manga ends, Kenpachi is a multi-galactic beast who can be scaled even higher when his Bankai power is stacked on top. But there's still more for us to talk about, because after the Bleach manga had ended, Kenpachi continued to get new showings of power during the Can't Fear on World light novels, as they confirmed that he's grown even stronger than he was in the 1000-Year Blood War arc. This is showcased when he proves to be more than a match for the immensely powerful hybrid being Hikone, who possessed the powers of multiple Soul King fragments, different souls, and even Gremmy's brain. This was a character who was being groomed to become the next Soul King, and was well on their way to becoming a worthy candidate. The only issue is that due to what we know now about the main metric for defining the worthiness of a Soul King candidate, I can't give Hikone the same scaling as Ichigo, since we don't know if they would also survive Irazu Sando. Despite this, considering Hikone's incredible strength and the limited number of characters capable of challenging them, I would place Hikone in the multi-galactic range of power. Either way, Kenpachi is able to fight against Hikone's maximum power while only using his Shikai. It is to be noted that he wasn't wearing his eye patch during this encounter. This is also combined with the fact that Kenpachi was able to completely obliterate Iko Mikidomoe after he had regained his true name and power, which in itself is nothing short of extraordinary. Iko Mikidomoe's strength was so colossal that his destruction was feared to potentially unbalance the Bleach universe, risking its annihilation. This is the very reason that he was initially sealed within a Zanpakuto. While there's not a lot that we can tell about how much power he had gained after regaining his name, it's still an impressive feat one-shotting an enemy who defeated a young Yamamoto. So all in all, I'd say that Kenpachi's spiritual energy is in the upper ranges of multi-galactic, which which would of course extend to his attack potency. Now with this being said, let's talk about Kenpachi's speed. When exploring the astonishing speed of Bleach's top tier characters, it is evident that they operate at an incredibly rapid pace, often bordering on or surpassing the speed of light. This is especially evident during the 1000-year Blood War arc, where multiple characters demonstrate speed feats on such a scale. Take for example Renji, who in his Shikai form outpaces Mask D Masculine's beam of light. Then there's Uetsu Nimaya, who even with his power restricted, moves faster than his own shadow in his battle against Askin. And let's not forget about Orihime, who effortlessly reacts to Yhwach's energy torrents multiple times during their battle. These torrents are capable of traversing the Bleach universe almost instantly. Given these impressive feats, it's hard to imagine Kenpachi being any slower than these characters. When we consider the moments that Kenpachi has become more powerful and the consistent portrayal of light speed scaling from earlier in the series, it's reasonable to conclude that Kenpachi is massively faster than light. This high speed performance is one of the most consistent aspects of the Bleach narrative, and I believe that this consistency should be the primary factor in determining the speed tier of Bleach characters. In my view, Kenpachi stands as an incredibly powerful Shinigami whose potential is matched only by the literal gods of the Bleach universe. The potential for the Bleach anime to further explore and expand upon Kenpachi's abilities during Core 3 and Core 4 of the anime makes me really excited. I'm also planning to create a follow-up video where I focus on the power of Kenpachi Zanpakuto no Zarashi, so definitely stick around to the channel and subscribe for that video. We're at the point of the video where I want to hand over the discussion to all of you. How strong do you guys think Kenpachi is? Was there anything about the feats that he has performed within the series that I have forgotten to mention? Let me know if you agree or disagree with my takes, and overall I just hope that you found this video insightful. Thanks for making it to the end of this video, and I look forward to seeing you in my next Bleach video.
If you enjoy my content, then you can support my channel through Patreon for as little as $1 a month, or even through YouTube by becoming a channel member. You will gain access to exclusive channel perks and a Discord server which I frequently use. So become a member of my Zero Division and be the first to know about my upcoming videos. And once again, thank you for sticking around till the end of the video, and whatever you contribute will mean a lot to me.